Sure. I would say that there are many different types of love. No one in the world, no one on the face of the earth thinks that love makes a marriage. And the reason is that that simple statement is true. Because everybody believes that there's love of many different forms, between friends, between parents, for their children, and vice versa. And the whole question is what makes marital love different? So it can't just be that there's commitment, that there's affection, that there's desire, that there's longing to be together. All of those things are in some form or other true of every type of love. The whole question is what makes love different in marriage? What makes it the kind of relationship that, besides involving love, has to involve permanence and exclusivity and monogamy and a sexual union, as opposed to other forms of cooperation or expressions of affection. And then my argument is eventually, by a couple different turns, which are nicely detailed in the book, that the only way to make sense of all of those things is also to see love, marital love, as involving a man and a woman.
Okay, we've got another one down here.
Sure.
As someone with an Anglican friend, what do you say to his view that as they have a homosexual friend who considers himself Christian, what do you say to his view that given that they're homosexual, that they don't really count as Christians?
Well, it's certainly false that anybody's desires alone make them not a Christian. Everyone in this room has had some desires that it would be wrong to act on, whether they're sexual or of other kinds. And probably almost everyone has had some in the realm of sex and marriage, desires that can't be integrated with the good of marriage. So that's certainly not disqualifying from Christianity. And I think, of course, in some sense, to be a Christian is to believe in Christ, and to believe in Christ is to believe in his words and to follow his commandments, as he himself said, if you love me, you'll follow my commandments. And to do that is to buy into the whole shebang, to buy all of the teachings of Christ through his church. So in the fullest sense, I think to be a Christian is to be that, and any impairment in that is an impairment in our friendship with Christ. But the church also teaches that there are degrees of communion. And so we can think that someone is a Christian in the sense that he shares the most basic and defining teachings of the church, buys into the whole Nicene Creed, but that communion is imperfect. It's impaired in some way by a rejection of one or another moral teaching.
Hi Sherif, my name is Dominic. I'm a religious education teacher at a high school. I teach predominantly young people. Could you tell me anything else from what you've already, all the suggestions you've given, how better would you approach very young people like teenagers regarding challenging issues? Because in my religious education classroom, I find mostly I'm the minority of the beliefs, for example, per se. So how would you go about, going about preaching to young people at that age?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I think that that's prime territory for these conversations, because they're at the age where they're just starting to get excited about ideas, and they like principles, and they want to follow principles to their conclusions, and at the same time, they're open-minded. They're not kind of gelled or settled into a particular path. So I think in some ways, trying to show people how consistency would require them to hold a view that they don't actually want to hold is, for somebody in that context, going to be really powerful, right? So and that always has to begin with finding out what's really motivating the other person. If, as the first questioner asked about, their main thing, which is quite likely given their age, is that they just think that if people love each other, that's a marriage. So then you test that, you show them why that doesn't work, because there are all these other forms of love. And then they say, no, it's really romance that makes a marriage. And then you say, well, but you wouldn't say that of a romantic trio. And say, okay, well, it's romance and bodily union, and only two people can really be united. And you ask, well, what makes for that, right? Anyway, I just think that it's the same basic process of a conversation that starts with the most common ground and then tries to inch towards a conclusion from there. Except that in some ways it's better circumstances for it, because ego is not an issue in the same way, or at least in this context with high schoolers. They don't feel like their ego's on the line in their beliefs, which are just starting to be formed. And they're eager to follow an argument to its conclusions and to follow a principle to its implications. So they're more open to seeing this, the potential difficulties in their view.
Yeah, I got one.
Yeah.
So we're down to mic looking a bit, but so often in gay marriage debate, when you're arguing any contrary position, you get labelled a radical bigot or a gay hater. What do you think the best ways to combat that? Not on an individual scale, but on a wider scale, because that's a perception that needs to change the treaty.
Sure, okay, I think I got most of that. In the gay marriage debate in particular, anytime you speak out against the redefinition of marriage, you immediately get labeled a bigot and a gay hater. How do you deal with that? How do you combat it? And so on. I don't remember, I didn't hear if there was more to the question, but I'll just address that. I think in some ways this is one of the easiest answers to clear off the table. And the reason is that the idea that marriage is a relationship of a man and a woman precedes the modern concept of a gay identity. Today's concept, I'm not saying that there have never been same-sex relationships. There have always been every form of sexual activity. But the concept we have today of a sexual orientation, picking out a class of human beings against whom you might have animus as a group, this is no older than the 19th century. And yet the idea that marriage is inherently a union of a man and a woman is common to every society and culture before the year 2000. Or if you want to look at it from another angle, that idea has been shared as much by cultures that think that same-sex sexual activity is immoral as it has been by cultures that are actually pretty okay with that, like communities in ancient Greece, who had very widespread same-sex relationships, especially among men, but who thought that marriage was just a completely different thing. If the idea is supposed to be that the vision of marriage as the union of a man and a woman is either bigotry or religion, whatever religion a person names, I can name them a community before that religion, or with no contact with that religion, that had the same view of marriage. So in this context, history has a way of immediately diffusing that objection. Now they might still have their doubts about you in particular, but in a certain sense, at that point, remember, our cause is not ourselves. And so we can at that point say, okay, well, I'll grant you whatever horrible things you want to believe about me. There's still an interesting question here, which is how could all of these cultures, all of these great thinkers who had no contact with Judaism or Christianity, like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Xenophanes, Musonius Rubens, Plutarch, all these folks who had remarkably worked out, in some cases, visions of marriage that were remarkably similar to the one I'm defending. There's an ancient philosophy scholar at Princeton, Gregory Vlastos, who's a secular atheist as far as I know, and liberal on social issues, who said, much to my chagrin, it turns out that Plato had basically the same view of sex and marriage as Pope Paul VI. That's a really fascinating fact that calls out for explanation that you can't explain by bigotry, because Plato lived in a society that was very favorable towards same-sex sexual activity, that you can't explain by group animus. He had nothing like our modern concept of a gay identity. That you can't explain by religion. Plato did not read a Baltimore Catechism. Plato did not have First Communion classes. And yet it's still sitting there. It's an intellectual challenge. And at that point, if the person is serious about ideas, the conversation has shifted. They're no longer able to just make this about you and your motivations. They are faced with an intellectual argument, explain this data in a way that you can't explain it by bigotry or religion. And now either they will accept that intellectual challenge or not. And once that is the ground of debate, once those are the terms of debate, it's a very different dynamic. And it's a way of motivating people. We're talking about the need to provide motivation. Motivating them by appealing to their sense of intellectual honesty. Like saying, that is simply an impossible explanation for this view. If you're serious about ideas, give me another one. Yes?
Thank you. What would you tell a parent who has a child who struggles with same-sex attraction?
Right, so the question is, what would you tell a parent who has a child who struggles with same-sex attractions? I think in that person's case, the thing that tends to be behind most people's support of same-sex marriage is going to be most intensely true in this case, which is a fear of loneliness, right? At the end of the day, most people think of marriage as the main way to resolve that most frightening condition. And they think that not having access to marriage means being doomed to loneliness. So I think the most important thing is to make sure that the person sees that that isn't true. That the person sees that there are that companionship doesn't require a sexual relationship, much less a sexual relationship that gets recognized by the state. And that all of the most powerfully affecting things that people seek within marriage, a constant source of advice, a sort of anchor through change, someone who's reliably there for your victories and for your defeats, who can be a kind of living and dynamic diary to share your most difficult issues with, to share your joys with. All of those things are possible in deep friendship. And just because our culture doesn't have easily recognized forms of that, and just because they're not quite common today because of the prevalence of this other idea of marriage as the only proper place for that, doesn't mean that people can't have it themselves. Here, the Christian tradition provides us with resources that most of us don't use. There are the biblical examples of David and Jonathan, where he says, "Your love is sweeter to me than the love of women." You have, and of course, today reading that with the concepts that we have, a lot of people want to say, it was repressed homosexuality, a completely sort of totally anachronistic explanation for what was really form of passionate friendship. We have John Henry Newman, who has written brilliantly and beautifully about friendship, and who in his own life, though no one seriously doubts that he broke any of his vows, had a very rich and deep friendship with a priest that he asked to be buried next to after death, as a kind of sign of the deep friendship they had. We have St. Aelred's book on spiritual friendship, which talks about the depths of communion that are possible when you find someone with whom you can pursue together love of Christ. So I think that is really important to make sure that they don't think that either God or the church is asking them to be lonely. And then the other thing, of course, is that in that, it's in general true, and the church teaches that it's impossible to have lifelong virtue without grace. But it's especially true on an issue where day in and day out someone is going to be told that they can't be happy unless they reject this. And so for that person, even more than usual, it'll be critical that friendship with Christ is the organizing principle of their life. That is the one thing necessary, even as they see it. So they have to be fostered in the faith. It's going to be important that they not think that the faith is demanding of them a life of loneliness, which is why the first point's key. But once that's in place, they have to have that as their primary motivation, because anything less will be probably too weak a motivation against what the culture will push them toward.
Hi, thank you for your talk. There were a lot of practical tips, and I guess I'm asking for another practical tip. As a medical student, I'm often faced with the popular view on abortion and euthanasia, which is that they're both well and truly scientific. They're the way of the future. And so every day I get the same sorts of lines, like, you'd offer this woman an abortion and so on. And so what kind of advice do you have with how do I pick my arguments? How do I pick the opportunities to speak up? And when should I just let it go?
One question from Karen. Yeah, g'day. I'm on a similar point. Just following on from that abortion topic. In your book, I saw your link on Facebook in regards to marriage, and it's fantastic. But with your reason, I think you mentioned, I guess my question is, when do you, faith and reason, so when do you refer to faith? When you mention God, Jesus? Or is your book centered purely on reason and back to abortion? How can you pick your argument without referring to God and the concept of the soul?
Great, okay, so on the first question, which sounds like partly what's the best kind of argument with people who say that science really points in the pro-choice position, and also what is the right context for making these different arguments, when you make it, when you let it go. On the first question, I mean, the short answer is that science doesn't take moral positions. The scientific method, if you used it day in and day out for 1,000 years, would not produce a single moral conclusion. Because science tells you about natural causes and natural effects. It tells you about what is the case, or what will be the case if you do this other thing. It doesn't tell you what ought to be. You could spend all day and you'll not get a scientific argument for my right or your right not to be killed. So I think the most important thing with a scientific audience is to get them to see that science doesn't favor their view, but it doesn't favor your view either, in the sense that alone it can't do the trick. What science does tell us in the context of the life issues is that the same organism that you see talking on the stage right now is the same organism that was once a child, and before that an infant, and before that a newborn, and before that a blastocyst, and before that a zygote at one cell. So science does tell us that much, which already points us to some extent, it does some of the work of the pro-life argument. And then it's moral reasoning that tells us that every one of those, every human being, has moral rights. So the most important thing is to get them out of the mindset where they think science can settle these issues all by itself. In terms of when to make the argument, look, I think sometimes the most that we can do is lodge our dissent. It's just make the objection and make it clear that there are people in their company, just as smart as they are, just as well trained in science or whatever other form of expertise that they think settles us the other way, and to show them that there are some people in their august company that disagree. And that itself can be very powerful and can start to upset and disturb their assumption that all the thinking people are with us. And to what extent you have more opportunity will just always depend on the circumstances in a way that it's really hard to give a general rule for. But again, I think that part of the question will have to be, is this a context where people have any chance of being receptive to an argument? Is there time to make an argument? Is there time to interrogate their view and to see where they think the lines are on moral rights and why they shouldn't be restricted or expanded from there? So it's always going to be a kind of case-by-case thing. And it's always going to depend on your audience, which I guess relates to the second question, right? So when do you invoke God? Look, I don't think it's wrong or impermissible or misguided or unfair to our fellow citizens in a pluralistic democracy to refer to God and to make theistic arguments. I think all arguments should be on the table in a public debate. And the main reason is that you're always going to be appealing to something that requires belief, something that isn't provable in the scientific way. I mean, it's kind of related to the first point. if whatever your view is, whether it's from Catholicism or from a kind of utilitarian philosophy that says you just add up pains and pleasures and see where there's more pain, more pleasure over pain, or whether you have a kind of no harm principle, all of those are forms of philosophy. And so there's no way of saying that those are in, but religion is out, right? That's the first thing. But I think, again, in general, when you appeal to God, depends on your audience. It depends on what you think will reach this person. That, if you're arguing with an evangelical or Protestant or an Anglican, you know that they share with you the scriptures, and so that's a place to go. If you are arguing with someone who might believe in God but might not believe in any particular religion, then you're open to then you might open to a different set of arguments that won't rely on the scriptures. And if you're arguing with someone who isn't responsive to any of that, I think you start with where they are. And when St. Paul says, be all things to all people, he lived it out himself in his own preaching. Right? When he goes to Areopagus, he says, this unknown God that you're talking about, let me talk to you about him. Let me talk to you about the law written on your hearts. And let's ask where that law leads. And which is a very different style from when he's talking to an early Christian community. And he can appeal to the words of our Lord. Right? So he himself set the great evangelist, the greatest that the church will ever know, himself set the example for this. The question of whether these arguments can be made without appeal to revelation or to kind of specifically theological ideas, there again, I think St. Paul tells us this is the law written on our hearts, as well as on the tablets that Moses brings us, right? These are principles that we can access by reason, even though they're also enlightened and illuminated and fortified by faith. On the particular life issue, I think the best book that does that is a book called Embryo, A Defense of Human Life, which lays out, without any appeal to the soul or any particular theological idea, the idea that you have a human being from conception on, and that the only way to be morally consistent is to say all human beings have basic rights. And from those two ideas alone, you can get the pro-life position. I'll just end with this point. The reason that we don't appeal to revelation in the book is not that we don't believe it or that we think it's illegitimate in public debates, but it's really because we think that there is special value in figuring out the reasons behind the commands that God gives us. That when God says in Genesis, or when we read in Genesis that there's a one flesh union, if we can get an account of what that means, of what it amounts to, of what makes it special, then we'll gain a deeper appreciation for God's law rather than the opposite. And that's basically what we try to do in the book, to show what that could mean, how it could have special value, and why, among many other things, it's possible only between a man and a woman. Let's put our hands together for Sherif Girgis.